This is the introduction to Volume 1 of the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. The introduction is titled Key Texts and Contributions to a Critical Theory of Society. The authors are Beverly Best, Werner Bonefeld, and Chris O'Kane. So here we go. The designation of the Frankfurt School as a, quote, critical theory originated in the United States. It goes back to two articles, one written by Max Horkheimer and the other by Herbert Marcuse, and both were published in Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, later Studies in Philosophy and Social Science, in 1937. One second. Let's see if I can get to the end notes here. I have to open this in a weird program because for some reason my Chromebook doesn't like this PDF. I couldn't tell you why. Looks like we're not going to have such luck, so I'll have to read the notes at the end. Anyway, the Zeitschrift, published from 1932 to 1941, was the publishing organ of the Institute for Social Research. It gave coherence to what in fact was an internally diverse and often disagreeing group of heterodox Marxists that hailed from a wide disciplinary spectrum, including social psychology, Fromm, Marcuse, Horkheimer, political economy and state formation, Pollack and Neumann, law and constitutional theory, Kirchheimer and Neumann, political science, Gerland, Neumann, philosophy and sociology, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, culture, Löwenthal, Adorno, musicology, Adorno, aesthetics, Adorno, Löwenthal, Marcuse, and social technology, Gerland, Marcuse. In the Weimar Republic, the Institute was known by sympathizers as, quote, Café Marx. It was the first Marxist research institute attached to a German university. Since the 1950s, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory has become an established, internationally recognized, quote, brand name in the social and human sciences, which derives from its institutional association in the 1920s and again since 1951 with the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, West Germany. From this institutional perspective, it is the association with the Institute that provides the basis for what is considered critical theory and who is considered to be a critical theorist. This handbook works with and against its branded identification, concretizing as well as refuting it. We retain the moniker Frankfurt School in the title to distinguish the character of its critical theory from other seemingly non-traditional approaches to society, including the positivist traditions of Marxist thought, constructivist idealism, French philosophies of structure, events, and rhizomes, post-colonialism, the abstract negativity of subjectivism, including the existentialist traditions, and contemporary Anthropocene and justice-oriented abstract normativism. New section, Critical Theory and Outline. In its original formulation, critical theory is characterized by thinking against the flow of the reified world. It is an attempt to brush against its grain, to reveal its foundations in historically specific social relations. It was the first serious Marxist attempt to confront the historical materialism of the orthodox Marxist tradition. According to the orthodoxy, labor is a transhistorical objective necessity, and the various modes of production present historically specific forms of labor economy. In this view, history is objectively unfolding towards a, quote, higher mode of production, socialism. For the orthodoxy, therefore, there can be no such thing as the critique of labor. There can only be a critique of the capitalist irrationality of labor organization, leading to the endorsement of socialism as a rational form of labor organization. Orthodox Marxism thus conceived of capitalism as transition to socialism either through reformist struggle for recognition of labor rights or revolutionary struggle as midway for a centrally planned labor economy. In the 1920s, Frankfurt School critical theory emerged from within the constraints of these positions as well as the deadly hostility that existed amongst their respective supporters and between the latter and their nationalist foes. Following Max Horkheimer, the opposite of a critical theory of society is not an uncritical theory, it is, quote, traditional theory. For Horkheimer, traditional theory is uncritical of its own social and historical preconditions. Instead of seeking to establish the social and historical constitution of its object, it identifies society as given, mere data. Against idealism, it holds that positivism is an element of critical thought. Critical theory is about the conceptuality of a historical reality. It is both a method of thought and a process of thinking in and through the social object. It is not a method of organizing concepts of thinking about society. Rather than applying thought to the social subject, it argues that conceptuality holds sway within it. This insight formulates the task of critical theory as an immanent critique of society, one that sets out to uncover what is active in objects. Thus, against positivism, it holds that in its immediate and direct appearance, the whole of society is untrue. Horkheimer's article, Traditional and Critical Theory, which is on this channel, argues that in its posited appearance, society presents itself in the form of petrified relations, which perpetuate themselves as if by some independent dynamic that is regulated by invisible forces. This appearance is real as necessary illusion, which is ideology. The ideology of the social object is its appearance as natural. According to Horkheimer, Marx was the first critical theorist who conceived of capitalist society as an objective illusion. That is, the fetishism of commodities is real as the objective inversion of the social relations that vanish in their appearance as a relationship between economic quantities, which are regulated by an invisible hand that, as Adorno put it, takes care of, quote, both the beggar and the king, end quote. Adorno. What is vanished cannot be identified nor conceptualized. What remains is the social subject as a non-conceptuality. Abstract things neither posit themselves, nor do they impose and reproduce themselves according to some innate, objectively unfolding logic. Rather, it is the social relations, individuals in and through their social praxis, that render social objectivity valid by bestowing it with a consciousness and a will. The veracity of this insight is no way challenged by the equally valid insight that the subjects act under the compulsion of social objectivity, on the pain of ruin and disaster. In this context, critical theory is best seen as an attempt at conceptualizing capitalist social objectivity as a definite form of human social practice. A definite form of human social practice. Critical theory thus becomes a negative dialectics of the conceptualized practice, begriffene praxis of capitalist social relations. As argued by Horkheimer in the Traditional and Critical Theory article, Marx's critique of political economy amounts to a devastating judgment on existence, not just of the economic sphere, but of society as a whole, as a totality. Totality is a negative concept of the wrong state of things. For Horkheimer, Marx's critique of political economy is social critique. It is critique of the economic categories as the valid categories of a, quote, false society. For Adorno, Marx's critical theory is characterized by its resistance to substituting the truth content of thought for its, quote, social function and its conditioning by interest, end quote. Traditional theory, says Adorno, quote, refrains from a critique, end quote, of social contents and, quote, remains indifferent to it, end quote. Adorno. It classifies and defines social phenomena but does not look into them. The purpose of critical theory as a critique of ideology is to uncover what is active in things, to reveal the socially constituted principle of compulsion, the power of society as a whole, in which the social subject, man in her social relations, appears as a mere character mask, Adorno, or personification, Marx, of reified relations between seemingly natural social things. It is, of course, true, as traditional theory recognizes, that the, quote, life of all men hangs, end quote, by the profitable extraction of surplus value. Time really is money, and money is money only as more money. Yet it does not ask why that might be so, and does not inquire into its conceptuality. That is, it does not attempt to comprehend the social laws that are innate to this mode of human and social reproduction as definite laws of human social practice. Furthermore, critical theory holds that social reality and theoretical praxis are the same and not the same. There is neither an untheoretical reality nor can reality be reduced to thought. Reality, the real, entails theory as the condition of its comprehension, meaning and practical intelligibility. Whether something is rational is a matter of thought and interpretation. The comprehension of reality is a theoretical effort, and the critique of reality is therefore a critique of its theorizing. Reality neither speaks for itself nor by itself. Reality's critique is fundamentally a theoretical critique, which is also a critique of epistemology and science. That includes philosophy and political economy. As a critical theory, therefore, materialism is, quote, a dissolution of things understood as dogmatic, end quote. In this context, Lukács's notion of, quote, false consciousness, end quote, which Lukács developed most clearly in the book History and Class Consciousness, is unhelpful. The, quote, enchanted, perverted, topsy-turvy world, end quote, of capitalist social relations, thought too is enchanted, perverted, and topsy-turvy. Critical theory is here characterized as an effort of critique, making thought work, which entails confrontation of the cogitative account of society with its experience. Critical theory holds that the theoretical concept of society is fundamentally an experienced concept and vice versa. Traditional theory might want to analyze society on the basis of algorithmic data. It can do this because it has no experience of society. What counts are numbers. Whether numbers inflate or deflate is, however, of no concern to the numbers themselves. It is a concern for the social subject. The validity of inflation or deflation is therefore a social validity. For traditional theory, experience is not a scientific category. It therefore includes what is vital from its analytical gaze. Nevertheless, the development, say, of economic theory into social statistics is not, quote, false, as opposed to the, quote, right theory of so-called Marxian economics. Economics, as the science of economic matter, meets definite social needs, takes the direct appearance of society as immediate proof of its veracity, analyzes the economic phenomena, and articulates the economic quantities in the form of mathematical equations. In this manner, it rationalizes society by scientific mathematical method. It does all this in the name of scientific method and accuracy without once asking itself what the economic categories are, what the economic quantities are quantities of, and indeed, why the effort of human social reproduction appears in the form of economic quantities that present themselves devoid of innate human contents. For the science of economic matter, the consideration of such contents and questions about their human social validity amounts to a metaphysical distraction. It inserts into economics a non-economic subject, disrupting the economic idea of purely economic matter. The critique of economics as a social science without a social content does not entail its recognition as a science of, quote, false consciousness. It rather entails social critique, that is, critique of a society that expresses itself in the form of economic categories and economic matter, which economic science seeks to render intelligible by rationalizing the economic appearance of society, without distraction. Traditional social theory does not see that economic forces are forces of definite social relations. Why indeed does this content, human social reproduction, the satisfaction of human need, take the form of independent economic categories, upon whose power, quote, the life of all man hangs by, end quote? The theory of society becomes no less traditional when it demythologizes the social object into a secular, quote, logic of things, that akin to an abstract system of logic structures the actual behavior, consciousness, and mentality of the actual individuals and their libidos too. In Adorno's memorable formulations in the book Negative Dialectics on this channel, reality requires thought for its comprehension, and historical materialism is critique of society understood dogmatically. It is critique of society through theoretical critique. Critical theory is characterized by its attempt to dissolve the dogmatic posture of social objectivity by revealing its vanished social genesis. It holds that in order to grasp the world, one has to be within it. Critical theory is critical on the condition that it thinks through society. What is vital about economic quantities is not their quantitative expansion. What is vital is their sheer unrest of life for access to the means of subsistence. Which for its success depends on economic growth for economic growth's own sake, on accumulation of abstract wealth for accumulation's sake. 1 second. God damn it. God damn it, I'm sorry. It's annoying. Okay, sorry about that. I had to calm myself down. As a critical theory, the critique of political economy entails the recognition of suffering as the hidden truth of the relations of economic objectivity. Critical theory, therefore, is a critique of a world that is, quote, hostile to the subject, end quote. No matter that it is the social individual herself who endows the reified world with a consciousness and a will, not just in the economic sphere, but in society at large, body and soul. In fact, Alfred Sohn-Rethel, who never established a close working relationship with the Institute, but who stayed in close contact with some of its members and whose theoretical concerns were also close, focused the program of research most clearly. It amounts to an anamnesis of the social origin or genesis of real abstractions. New section: History and Thought. The Institute was founded in Frankfurt am Main in 1923, where it was affiliated with the University of Frankfurt am Main. It was the creation of Felix Weil. Weil was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Weil was the son of a wealthy grain merchant and was able to use money from his father's business to finance the Institute. Weil graduated with a doctoral degree in political science from Frankfurt University. His doctoral thesis was about the practical problems of implanting socialism through central economic planning. It was published by Karl Korsch. The immediate background to his initiative was the first Marxist work week, which Weil also financed. It was a week-long symposium in 1922, attended amongst others by Georgy Lukács, Karl Korsch, Karl August Wittfogel, and Friedrich Pollock, a friend of Horkheimer's and co-founder of the Institute. Wittfogel was a historian noted for his studies of ancient China and is best known for developing the notion of an Asiatic mode of production. Korsch's book, Marxism and Philosophy of 1923, which broke the ground for the development of heterodox Marxism, was discussed at the symposium. Korsch worked at the Institute in exile but never joined it formally. Lukács's book, History and Class Consciousness, also published in 1923, was a major inspiration for the development of the Frankfurt School, particularly because of its argument about reification and identification of the importance of Hegel's philosophy for Marx's critique of political economy. The relationship between Lukács and critical theory is perhaps best described with reference to Wiggershaus's account of a meeting between Lukács and Adorno in 1925. Adorno, who began his association with the Institute in 1928 and became a formal member in New York in 1938, is said to have been shocked to find that, in an attempt to restore his reputation as a reliable supporter of the Bolsheviks, Lukács was retracting precisely what had attracted Adorno to his work in the first place, namely the critique of capitalist society as a reified totality. If indeed Lukács was Adorno's intellectual mentor, the mentoring proved short-lived and unreliable. Similarly, Neumann and Kirchheimer had started out as socialist students of Carl Schmitt's, and Marcuse had started his second doctorate, his Habilitationsschrift, under Martin Heidegger. Schmitt and Heidegger promptly supported the Nazi regime and joined its ranks as intellectual flag-bearers. Marcuse joined the Institute in 1932, having been recruited by Leo Löwenthal. Löwenthal had joined the newly formed Institute in 1926 and established himself as its leading expert on the sociology of literature and mass culture. Leo Löwenthal was the founding managing editor of the Zeitschrift, which was published from the United States for most of its existence. In the face of the Nazis' growing influence, including at Frankfurt University, the Institute's founders decided in September 1930 to prepare to move abroad. They established a branch in Geneva and moved the Institute's funds to the Netherlands. In 1932, shortly after Löwenthal had recruited him, Marcuse was sent to Geneva in preparation for possible exile. The Gestapo closed down the Institute in early 1933 for, quote, activities hostile to the state, end quote. The initial research at the Institute was close to Weil's interest in social history of the workers' movement. Its first publishing venture was the first critical edition of the collected works of Marx and Engels, with the Institute acting as a mediator between the Moscow-based Marx-Engels Institute and the German Social Democratic Party. It was this venture that reinforced existing strongly held suspicions about the Institute as subversive and led to a police investigation into the background of its members. The police concluded that Felix Weil and Friedrich Pollock were undoubtedly communists. Pollock came in for special treatment on the grounds of his activities during the Munich Soviet in 1919. I have a biography of Friedrich Pollock on this channel. During the 1920s, Löwenthal's sociological approach was the exception in the Institute. Its designated first director was Kurt Albert Gerlach, who died before the Institute's inauguration. He sympathized with anarcho-syndicalism and published on industrial relations and the conditions of female factory workers in England. Gerlach's successor and founding director was Karl Grünberg, a Marxist historian seen as the, quote, father of Austrian socialism, end quote. He counted Otto Bauer, Rudolf Hilferding, and Karl Renner amongst his students. Grünberg took his journal, Archive for the History of Socialism and the Labor Movement, which he had started in Vienna in 1910, with him to Frankfurt. It became the house journal of the Institute until 1930, when it ceased publication. The two most important publications of the Institute during this time were Henryk Grossmann's book, The Law of Accumulation and Breakdown of the Capitalist System, and Friedrich Pollock's book, Attempts at Planned Economy in the Soviet Union, 1917 to 1927, both published in 1929. After Grünberg suffered from a stroke, Grünberg retired in 1929, and Pollock stepped in as acting director. Pollock was succeeded in 1930 by Max Horkheimer, who was not the obvious candidate, but who was chosen despite his leanings towards council communism. In the same year, Erich Fromm, who became one of the founders of, quote, socialist humanism, end quote, joined the Institute. Under Horkheimer's directorship, the Institute's research profile started to change from one focused on mainly economic developments and labor movement studies towards empirical social research, social theory, cultural study, philosophy, and social psychology, firming up the interdisciplinary research associated with critical theory. Frankfurt School critical theory was shaped by profound experiences. It originated in the aftermath of the failed Soviet Revolution after Lenin's death and at the beginning of the new economic policy that was accompanied by the resolutely dictatorial direction of the Soviet state under Stalin. It originated, too, in the aftermath of the failed German Revolution of 1918 that led to the short-lived Weimar Republic, which despised the revolutionaries and was rejected by the Ancien regime and its willing foot soldiers. Horkheimer took on the directorship of the Institute against the background of the crash of 1929 and the worldwide socioeconomic and political consequences that followed. On the one hand, hyperinflation, depression, austerity. The German Chancellor from 1930 to March, the German Chancellor from the 30th of March 1930 to the 30th of May 1932, Heinrich Brüning, was called the Hunger Chancellor, the Famine Chancellor. Mass unemployment, political violence and assassinations, emergency government, politicized labor relations, and a strong but bitterly divided labor movement, and, on the other, Nazi stormtroopers. Against the background of German Nazism and Italian fascism, Herbert Marcuse wrote about the coming to power of a new form of liberalism, which he conceived of as an authoritarian liberalism. It entailed, Marcuse argued in 1934, the, quote, existentialization and totalization of the political sphere, end quote, Marcuse. The decisive experiences for the formation of critical theory were the failure of revolutions, the total collapse of the German labor movement in 1933, the conditions of, quote, bare life, the Nazi dictatorship, Stalinist show trials and concentration camps, World War exile and disorientation, anti-Semitism as political program, and industrialized slaughter. With the exception of Adorno, the small band of critical theorists left Germany in 1933, settling either in New York or Los Angeles. Walter Benjamin, the great literary critic and condemner of positivist Marxism, eventually settled in Paris. During the 1930s, the Institute provided Benjamin with publishing opportunities and, most importantly, financial support. Adorno, who had been introduced to Benjamin in the early 1920s by a mutual friend, Siegfried Kracauer, was instrumental in securing the support. When Paris fell to the Nazis in 1940, he fled south with the intention of escaping to the United States via Spain. Informed by the chief of police at the France-Spain border that he would be turned over to the Gestapo, Benjamin committed suicide. Adorno had hoped to remain in Germany after 1933 and until 1934 hoped that the German army would take over. He enrolled for advanced studies at Oxford in June 1934 and during the next 4 years made trips to Germany to see his parents and in 1937 to New York to visit the Institute. He left Europe for the United States in 1938. The focus of study in exile, initially the focus of study in exile was authoritarianism, starting with the collected volume Studies on Authority and Family of 1936, which amongst others, Fromm, Marcuse, and Horkheimer contributed, when Horkheimer's article, The Authoritarian State, published in 1942, as well as particular analyses of the character of the Nazi state, Neumann, Pollock, and also Kirchheimer and Gerland, Kristallnacht in 1938 was the immediate precursor of Horkheimer's article The Jews of Europe, published in 1939. The extermination of European Jewry changed the Institute's research outlook decisively. Its two bases in the United States, in New York and Los Angeles, developed overlapping and yet distinct research programs on anti-Semitism and unreason. One was led by Pollock from the East Coast, leading to the publication of a 4-volume work entitled Studies in Anti-Semitism, and the other work was led by Horkheimer and Adorno from California on the Dialectic of Enlightenment, Unreason, leading to their book Dialectic of Enlightenment and to Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason, both published in 1947. The Authoritarian Personality was published in 1950, and Adorno's book Minima Moralia, Reflections from Damaged Life in 1951. Erich Fromm's The Fear of Freedom of 1941 explored damaged life in social psychological terms. The Institute returned to Frankfurt in 1951. However, of its core members, only Pollock, Adorno, and Horkheimer returned. Leo Löwenthal, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, Franz Neumann, and Otto Kirchheimer did not, nor did the majority of the Institute's members. The designation, quote, Frankfurt School, which came to the fore only in the 1950s, need not then be fixed on the Institute's post-war location. It is much more fruitful rather to see the Institute's decidedly heterodox Marxist social critique as originating in a specific formative experience in Weimar Germany and developing through the experience of exile, loss, and disorientation. It continued to mature against itself in the context of Auschwitz and later established itself as a dissenting voice in the Cold War silences. Later still, it became a theoretical expression of the new left that emerged in the movements associated with 1968. Of the critical theorists who returned to Germany in the 1950s, Adorno is the only one whose publishing took off, leading especially to the book Negative Dialectics in 1966 and Aesthetic Theory in 1970, which was published posthumously. The experience of exile and loss, authoritarianism and barbarism, tragedy and dashed hope re-emerged in the book Negative Dialectics as a form of thought that turns thinking inside out by revealing its affective origin in, quote, suffering. The experienced catastrophe was not an aberration of an otherwise civilized world. It showed what the civilized world is capable of. What lies within its concept is not the idea of a future humanity that reconciled with itself, organizes its social affairs and freedom from coercion according to its needs. This great idea of an equality of individual human needs that constitutes the association of the free and equal, as Marx put it in the Communist Manifesto. Rather, what lies within its concept is the promise of barbaric violence. The catastrophe asserted the hidden veracity of bourgeois reason, revealing its conceptuality and domination. Adorno's Negative Dialectics claimed that, quote, Hitler had imposed a new categorical imperative upon humanity in the state of their unfreedom to arrange their thinking and conduct so that Auschwitz never repeats itself, so that nothing similar will happen again. In the context of post-war Germany and beyond, Adorno's stance was singular and unique. It enthused the emerging New Left with frustrating consequences. Adorno rejected the student revolt of 1968 as quasi-action. In 1962, Adorno had called for a, quote, praxis that fights barbarism, end quote, and in his lectures endorsed Marx as the thinker who directed his critique, quote, at the substance, end quote, of society. That is, the, quote, social production and reproduction of life of society as a whole, end quote, Adorno. Adorno held the insight that, quote, society remains class struggle, end quote. However, and distinct from a whole tradition of Marxist theory, class struggle is not something positive or indeed desirable. On the contrary, class struggle is the objective necessity of the false society. It belongs to its concept. The book Negative Dialectics thus argues that bourgeois society is, quote, antagonistic from the outset, end quote, and that it, quote, maintains itself only through antagonism, end quote, Adorno. Class struggle does not posit an alternative to capitalist society and does not go beyond it. That is to say, class struggle is not a positive category of history in the making. It is entirely negative category, and the struggle to make ends meet is no longer an ontological privilege. Rather, it is a great misfortune. Quote, proletarian language is dictated by hunger. The poor chew words to fill their bellies, end quote. Like Benjamin, in his Theses on the Philosophy of History, Adorno holds that, quote, there is a quote, there is a tenderness only in the coarsest demand, that no one should go hungry anymore, end quote. Adorno. The orthodox Marxist dictum of capitalism as transition to socialism had long been shown up since Lenin as mere leadership propaganda, which lived on in academic circles and as official state ideology in the countries of the then Eastern Bloc. Herbert Marcuse, too, demanded a praxis that fights barbarism. Marcuse's writings snatched Marx from the orthodox embrace, establishing a new Hegelian Marxism in the book Reason and Revolution, and Freudian Marxism in the book Eros and Civilization of 1955, and denouncing Eastern Marxism in Soviet Marxism 1958, where he developed the notion of the communist individual as the subject of emancipated society. Marcuse established the contours of a new revolutionary subject amidst the closed society of an administered world in the book One-Dimensional Man of 1964, posing the conundrum of revolution. Slaves, he argued, quote, have to be free for their liberation before they can become free, end quote. Marcuse. At the height of the 1968 movement, he explored liberation in an article titled An Essay on Liberation, 1969. Marcuse later assessed the balance of forces of history in the book Counter-Revolution and Revolt, advocating a counsel-communist approach to revolution, and in his final work titled The Aesthetic Dimension of 1978, Marcuse examined the political character of works of art. Contrary to Adorno's characterization of the movement of 1968 as quasi-action, Marcuse and also Ernst Bloch, though not amongst the central figures of the Frankfurt School was a figurative intellectual influence on it, participated in the revolt and influenced a great number of its student activists, from Hans-Jürgen Kroll and Rudi Dutschke to Angela Davis. There should be some caution put around Angela Davis. She also met with, maybe I'm making this up, but she also met with, what the hell is his name? Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure she was like welcomed by the East German state. One of the more authoritarian of the Eastern Bloc states, to my understanding. and also a member of the Communist Party USA, way past when anybody with critical thinking skills should have been involved. Unlike Adorno's post-war publications, which critique the commodified world of social relations, Marcuse's focus on the power and probability of the rebellious subject, charting the emergence and assertion of the new left in theoretical terms and calling for liberation, endorsed the movements associated with 1968 in a direct manner. Critical theories call for a praxis that fights barbarism and entails a shift from a critical theory of the object towards one of the subject. It articulates the need for the subject either to prevent the barbarism inherent in unfreedom from asserting itself, Adorno, or to resist the totally administered world and reified forms of experience, consciousness, and rationality, Marcuse, including gender relations, racism, sexual repression, body and soul, Fromm, to achieve liberation of the subject from oppression and repressive personality in whatever form. The movements associated with 1968 fractured the post-war consensus irretrievably. For some, it was the soon to be disappointed beginning of radical and indeed revolutionary change. Others saw it as an opportunity for greater tolerance and progressive democratic renewal. Conservative critics recognized 1968 as the beginning of the end of their world. They held the Frankfurt School responsible for the turmoil and denounced it as one of the causes of terrorism. It was against this background that the Habermasian revision of critical theory found its voice. The new direction of critical theory under Habermas might best be exemplified by his retort to Adorno's insight that the, quote, radical effect, bracket, of the capitalist form of labor, end bracket, on the concept of practice, end quote. For Adorno, capitalism, quote, in capitalism, quote, the needs of human beings, the satisfaction of human beings is never more than a sideshow, end quote. Adorno proclaimed that, quote, the abolition of hunger, bracket, requires, end bracket, a change in the relations of production, end quote. Adorno. In distinction, Habermas argued that, quote, liberation from hunger and misery does not necessarily converge with liberation from servitude and degradation. For there is no automatic developmental relation between labor and interaction, end quote. Habermas's path-breaking work is the book The Theory of Communicative Action of 1984, which concerns the process of formation of public opinion and rational discussion. It is an attempt to rescue the ideas of the Enlightenment from the critique to which Horkheimer and Adorno subjected them in Dialectic of Enlightenment. Habermas moved critical theory away from Marx and back to the principles of idealist reason and classical conceptions of political morality. Habermas reconfigured critical theory as an extension of the Enlightenment project, seeking to free reason from instrumental rationality in support of a perfectly civil society, constitutionalism, and cosmopolitan democratic forms of government. Habermas's democratic conception of reason involved what he termed, quote, discourse ethics, which posited communication of reason's form of social action. Habermas's revision of critical theory as a philosophy of reason unbound by the unsocial irrationality of the relations of domination and exploitation positions the democratic constitutional state as the pinnacle of social morality. His communicative action derived from many sources and was consciously eclectic, from Gadamer's conservatism via Luhmann's system theory to pragmatic philosophy, which in the case of Dewey, the critical theory of Adorno and Horkheimer had regarded with great suspicion. Axel Honneth's theory of recognition builds on Habermas's pragmatist turn. His contribution came to the fore during the 1990s after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and at the emergence of a so-called new economy that was variously called neoliberalism, financialization, or globalization. Honneth's account focuses on normative forms of social interaction in the purportedly differentiated economic, political, and private spheres that are held to be independent of the dominating economic logic of the social reproduction of capitalist society. This also means, however, that he regards such a conception as the economic logic of social reproduction as one that critical theory does not touch. Whereas Habermas returns to Kant to establish the reason of communicative action on rational and moral bases, Hannett goes back to Hegel to establish his theory of recognition with philosophical argument. As he sees it, modernity is characterized by a welcome expansion of rights claims by actors who, as a consequence of their struggle for recognition, quote, have to be taken into consideration, end quote. Hannett therefore argues that because of the dynamic of recognition, which establishes a, quote, expansive participation in rational will formation, end quote, contemporary society contains within itself the, quote, promise of freedom, end quote. The poverty of conditions, which critical theory originally recognized as belonging to the conceptuality of the capitalist social relations, now appears contingent upon the capacity and power of the forces of recognition to impose participatory demands upon economic processes, moralizing the global economy through cosmopolitan schemes. In fact, Hannett's proposals for socialism are not dissimilar to the reformist ideas at the start of the last century, which proposed to create institutions of social freedom and solidarity that realized the Enlightenment's normative project for society as a whole, establishing a just and fair labor economy based beyond social class divisions and struggles. Hannett links critical theory with concrete practices and institutions, which entail the premises of freedom through what Hirsch termed a politics of, quote, radical reformism, end quote. The distinction between the old and the new is sharp. Whereas the founding critical theorists conceived of bourgeois society as one of unfreedom and barbarism as a potential means of sustaining it, quote, contemporary critical theory, end quote, goes back to the philosophers of reason, Kant and Hegel, to ascertain the promise of freedom in contemporary society. Instead of stopping its further progress as Benjamin demanded for the sake of avoiding catastrophe, the critical theory associated with Habermas and Hannett now demands its further development to achieve the progress of reason beyond the pathologies of the present. Whereas the founding thinkers understood social pathologies as innate to the existing relations of social objectivity, it now seems that social pathology is contingent upon the power of the social forces that act upon social situations. The judgment on existence that Horkheimer brought to attention in his 1937 critique of traditional theory appears no longer as a judgment about the character of definite social relations. Instead, it appears as a contingent social situation that can be rectified depending upon the power of those left behind to demand recognition of their needs through democratic assembly. Therefore, the idea of a linear trajectory, however fractured from the founding critical theorist, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse in particular, to the contemporary critical theory of Habermas and Hannett, is more apparent than real. It is pure ideology to claim that a first generation was replaced by a second generation, and now by a third generation, etc., which shaped critical theory in its own specific ways according to the demands of its day. Discontinuities and drastic shifts notwithstanding, it is also the case that mostly under the radar of academic officialdom and on the margins of academic respectability, an Adorno-inspired critical social theory of the object and also of the subject continues both within and outside the university and both within Europe and outside Europe, including the Americas. On the one hand, there is the social critique of the object that led to a reconstruction of Marx's critique of political economy as a critical social theory, including Wertkritik or value critique, open Marxism, and the Neue Marx-Lektur, New Marx reading, associated with Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt, both students of Adorno's. In the United States, the development of critical theory as a critique of the economic object belongs to Moishe Pistone as well as Patrick Murray, Christian Lotz, and Tony Smith. On the other hand, a critical theory of the subject, experience, history, and praxis was developed by Knecht, Kluge, Schmidt, and Krall, all students of Adorno's, and Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez, Roberto Schwartz, and Paulo Orantes, as well as Jameson, in his critique of postmodernism and aesthetics. Feminist critical theory was developed amongst others by Nancy Fraser in the United States and Regina Becker-Schmidt, Axel Gudrun Knapp, and Roswitha Schultz in Germany. Furthermore, John Holloway emerged as the voice of the subject in resistance, negative power. Since the 1970s, the early critical theory of the state, from Horkheimer's authoritarian state to Pollack's and Neumann's analyses of the character of the Nazi state, has provided the background to the emergence of a heterodox Marxist state theory that developed in the context of the political challenge of 1968, the crisis of the welfare state, and so-called globalization. In the German case, Johannes Agnoli pioneered a critique of political form and also legal form, which developed further as the German state derivation debate and as the Conference of Socialist Economists state debate in the UK. Considered as a concept, critical theory has its own conceptuality. The persistence of critical theory, its continued resistance against traditional theory, and its own traditionalization and its expansion into new areas including urbanity and space and post-colonialism show first of all that its original concerns with social praxis and the critique of social totality remained unbroken. Furthermore, they also show that the development of critical theory is not linear. Critical theory is not some abstract meta-theory. Rather, critical theory belongs to and develops in and through the social constellations that it seeks to render intelligible with practical political intent. Lastly, critical theory is not bound by disciplinary borders and never was. On the contrary, it is characterized by its refusal to comply with academic discipline and disciplinary requirements. It thinks against the order of the world to understand the world better. Interdisciplinarity does not mean lumping disciplines together, rather entails thinking in and through social relations, becoming aware of totality through the particular traits of the manifold manifestations that constitute society as a definite praxis of human social reproduction. The conceptuality of critical theory defies definition. It is critique of society for the sake of society. At its best, and with reference to Marx, it makes the petrified relations dance by uncovering the sheer unrest of life that endows society as a real abstraction with a dynamic, a consciousness and a will, however perverted in the form of the social object and the social action that it entails. New section, Scope and Purpose. The Handbook expounds the development of critical theory from its founding thinkers to its contemporary formulations in an interdisciplinary and global setting. The Handbook showcases the scholarly rigor, intellectual acuteness, and negative force of critical social theory in all its theoretical manifestations, past and present, and sketches its potential future trajectories in a world that remains fundamentally hostile to the needs of human beings and to the survival as opposed to the disintegration of human society itself. Our contributors are not academic gatekeepers and disciplinarians, nor do they understand critical theory in institutional terms. We ask them to think freely and to disregard the security of academic borders. The Handbook maps the terrain of a critical social theory, expounding its distinctive character vis-a-vis alternative theoretical perspectives, exploring its theoretical foundations and developments, conceptualizing its subject matter, both past and present, and signaling its possible future in a time of war and terror, climate change, mass migration, economic hardship, nativism, nationalism, and populism. Critical theory, at least in its founding tradition, did not look on the bright side. Especially in a time of great uncertainty and social mischief, it is important to look into the eye of the storm and ascertain what is active in things. With Adorno, the Handbook holds that the time of human emancipation from social compulsion by real abstractions is the time of human purposes. Quote, free disposable time. Quote, freely disposable time. End quote. Adorno, quote, time for enjoyment, end quote. Marx is the very content of an emancipated humanity. It posits a form of human wealth that is entirely at odds with the existing form of wealth, in which time is the existing form of wealth, in which time is money, and in which money is more money. Negative Dialectics, the book, brushes the categories of social objectivity against their grain with practical intent, so that the reason of human emancipation does not become, quote, a piece of the politics it was supposed to lead it out of, end quote. New section. Volumes and structure. The handbook is published in 3 volumes. Volume 1 is entitled Key Text and Contributions to a Critical Theory of Society. It maps the terrain of critical social theory in terms of key contributors and key contributions, subject matters, and critical theoretical developments. Volume 2, Key Themes and Context of the 20th Century, introduces the key themes of a critical theory of society and explores critical theory as a critique of the social object and the social subject. Volume 3, Context, expounds the development of critical theory in the context of alternative theoretical approaches and in a contemporary context of social crises, movements, and theories. Volume 1 contains chapters on key contributors to the development of a critical theory of society beyond the confines of the Frankfurt School. With the exception of Chapter 9, which explores dialectic of enlightenment, the chapter provides biographical introductions to key thinkers and develop a critical textual and contextual analysis of key notions and texts. Volume 1 comprises 3 parts. Part 1, The Frankfurt School and Critical Theory, contains chapters that introduce the key founding figures of a critical theory of society, including John Abromeit on Horkheimer, Christoph Hesse on Löwenthal, Kieran Durkin on Fromm, Paul Mattick Jr. on Grossmann, Karsten Olson on Neumann, Frank Schale, Lisa Klingsporn, and Hubertus Buchstein on Kirchheimer, David Kaufmann on Benjamin, Charles Reitz on Marcuse, Nico Bobka and Dirk Braunstein on Adorno, plus Marcel Stoetzler on the book Dialectic of Enlightenment as a single publication. The book Dialectic of Enlightenment was co-authored by Horkheimer and Adorno and includes an important contribution from Löwenthal. It is a core text of critical theory in which they scrutinize the demise of the Age of Reason into barbarism. Distinct from traditional Marxism, it argued that the capitalist relations do not contain a developmental logic towards human emancipation. Instead, they manifested and continue to manifest barbarism as a prospective destiny. Jürgen Habermas held that the book Dialectic of Enlightenment conceived of bourgeois society as a mode of irrational rationality beyond reconciliation. That is, it left, quote, nothing in reserve to which it might appeal, end quote, for it lacked any, quote, dynamism upon which critique could base its hope, end quote. This led to Habermas's revision of critical theory as a discourse ethics intended to assure the further progress of Enlightenment reason in contemporary society.
Tom?
Yeah.
Turn the dryer on. Did you forget to turn it on? Was it not turned on for a reason?
Oh, I forgot. Thank you. Part 2, titled Theoretical Elaborations of a Critical Social Theory, contains chapters that introduce the development of critical social theory by figures that were closely associated with the founding thinkers, either as colleagues, friends, or students. Its chapters include Kat Moore on Ernst Bloch and his philosophy of hope, and Erich John Russell on Georg Lukács, whose work was not only of immense importance for the development of critical theory, but also subject to robust critique by Adorno in particular. Ansgar Martens focuses on Siegfried Krakauer, also a close friend and critic of Adorno's. He was an early critic of mass culture who, like Habermas some decades later, challenged Adorno's critical theory for its negativity. Nothing remains on which to fall back and build something new. Two further chapters by Christian Fowler and Hubertus Buchstein introduce Alfred Seidel and A.R. Gerland. Gerland is a largely forgotten member of the Institute. In exile, he worked closely with Neumann and Kirchheimer on the political character of bourgeois society and Nazism. Compared with Gerland, Alfred Seidel is entirely unknown. He was, however, a decisive figure in the heterodox theoretical milieu of Frankfurt in the early 1920s, and the emergent critical theorists were familiar with him as a thinker of unconditional negativity. Frank Engster and Oliver Schlaut's chapter about Alfred Sohn-Rethel introduces a thinker who appears on the scene Who appears on the margins of the official history of the critical theory. Who appears on the margins of the official history of critical theory. In the 1920s, Alfred Sohn-Rethel was in close contact with Bloch, Benjamin, Krakauer, and Adorno. Especially for Adorno's exposition of critical theory as negative dialectic, Sohn-Rethel's understanding of historical materialist critique as anamnesis of the genesis of social objectivity and of bourgeois society as real abstraction were of decisive importance. With one exception, Johannes Agnoli, whom Stefan Grigat discusses, chapters on this channel already, the remaining chapters in this part introduce theoretical elaborations and challenges by students of Horkheimer and Adorno, including Hermann Kosiba on Alfred Schmidt, that piece is on this channel, Richard Langston on Alexander Kluge and Oscar Knecht, Hodi Meso on Hans-Jürgen Kroll, Ingo Elba on Helmut Reichelt, that piece is on this channel, Riccardo Bellafiore and Tommaso Rodolfi Riva on Hans-Georg Barkhaus, and Christoph Henning on Jürgen Habermas. Schmidt's work focused on praxis as a category of critical social theory. He conceived of it with nature as a category of the human metabolism, explored the capitalist conceptuality of nature and human praxis, and rejected the structuralist view of history and society, Althusser in particular as an exemplar of traditional theory. For Schmidt, the economic critique of Marx is a critique of the entire system of social reproduction. With the exception of Habermas, this understanding of Marx's critique of political economy as a critical social theory is key also to the theoretical elaboration of the subsequent contributors to the theoretical elaborations of critical theory. Alexander Kluge and Oscar Knecht introduced the notion of obstinacy as a category of the critique of history as universal, linear, and unfolding. Experienced history is cognizant of violence as the midwife of the constituted forms of civility. Social objectivity hides suffering. Turning to the chapter on Hans-Jürgen Kroll, who was at the forefront of 1968 in Germany, we see his exposition of critical theory as critique of political economy as practical. Given the conditions of economic objectivity, and as Marcuse had argued, integration of the working class into the capitalist system, Kroll asked about the agent and means of human emancipation. He developed the idea of praxis of social struggle as revolutionary process, an idea that partly in critique of Habermas, Knecht, and Kluge later explored. With greater depth when writing about proletarian experience and the proletarian public sphere. Kroll's work on economic objectivity opened the door of critical theory to autonomous Marxism. See Volume 3. Holloway's account, see below, and to the so-called Neue Marx-Lektura, associated in particular with the work of Reichelt and Barkhaus. One of its, quote, beginnings is a paper on the value form, prepared by Barkhaus for a seminar led by Adorno, but which never materialized due to Adorno's untimely death. Barkhaus's value form analysis emphasized the social character of capitalist wealth, that in the form of money presents itself in the form of seemingly independent economic categories. He explored these categories as inverted social categories. The Neue Marx-Lektura put Adorno's critical theory to work on Marx's Capital. For Reichelt in particular, the new reading entailed a negative dialectic, which he unfolded in the form of a dialectical presentation of economic categories, uncovering a process of economic inversion of definite social relations. In their specific ways, the contributions by Barkhaus, Reichelt, and Kroll, as well as those of Schmidt, Knecht, and Kluge, developed critical theory as a critique of society, of social praxis in the form of inverted economic categories, uncovering a dynamic of social compulsion through the movement of fundamentally economic things. The two exceptions to these elaborations of critical theory are Johannes Agnoli and Jürgen Habermas. Agnoli's critical theory focused on the state as the political form of bourgeois society. Agnoli's critique of politics examined the political character of the critique of political economy against the background of earlier critical theory about the authoritarian state and its enduring significance in the post-war liberal democracies. In the context of these further elaborations of critical theory, Jürgen Habermas's critical theory is distinct. It offers neither a critique of the economic object and its political character, nor a critique of the socially specific forms of human praxis and its relationship to nature. His critical theory is characterized by its ethical commitments towards reason. He established a critical theory of social civility and ethical conduct through moral government. Habermas is the outstanding German public intellectual of the last century, and his critical theory provides philosophical underpinnings to his commitments. Part 3 of Volume 1 is titled Critical Reception and Further Developments. Contains chapters that introduce the further development of a critical theory of society by figures that were influenced by, took up, and elaborated key themes of Frankfurt School critical theory. In particular, it contains a chapter by Andrew Brouwer-Latz on Gillian Rose, her critique of neo-Kantianism and her notion of the, quote, broken middle, end quote, in post-fascist modernity. The scheme of the Neue Marx Lectura is developed further with a chapter by Elena Luisa Longa on Moishe Pistone and his exploration of the critique of political economy as a critique of labor. Pistone's work rejects the tradition of laborism and Marxian economics in a direct manner, arguing that Marx's critique of political economy amounts to a critique of labor. This theme is further developed in Anna Cecilia Dinerstein's chapter on John Holloway's critique of the state and political reading of Adorno. The expansion of critical theory as the dialectical critique of reification and utopia in postmodernity is taken up in Carolyn Lesiak's chapter on the work of Frederick Jameson, Claudia Lieb, and Michael J. Thompson's chapters on Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth's notions of redistribution and recognition critically expound the principal development of post-Habermasian thought in critical theory. The part also contains chapters by André Sanz de Cecilia, Stefan Gondler, Nicholas Brown, and Pedro Rocha de Oliveira on Latin American thinkers who developed the tradition of critical theory from within their own historical context, socio-economic conditions, and cultural settings. These thinkers, Bolivar Echevarria, Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez, Roberto Schwartz, and Paulo Arantes, developed their own reading of Marx's critique of political economy as a critical social theory. The chapter on Bolivar Echeverria explores his critique of capitalist social production through the notion of the, quote, E-T-H-E, unquote, by which he understood historically specific cultural configurations of modes of life. The chapter on Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez introduces his philosophy of praxis as a critique of everyday consciousness. This topic is further developed in the chapter on Roberto Schwartz, whose critique of modern Brazilian culture developed the critical theory notion of, quote, social form, and, quote, as a critique of realism as social process in the then periphery of capitalist society. Finally, the chapter on Paulo Arantes introduces a thinker of the dialectics of Brazilian modernity and its historical temporality. Arantes reads the, quote, north by the, quote, south, and in this matter he joins Schwartz, Vasquez, and Echeverria in making an unrivaled contribution to a critical theory of the so-called periphery and its relationship to global capitalism. Acknowledgements. We are indebted to Neil Larson for his guidance and advice on the tradition of critical theory in Latin America and Wertkritik. Marcel Stoetzler was instrumental in conceiving of the Handbook project in its initial phase. In addition, we are indebted to our advisory board for its most welcome support through all phases of the Handbook. Special thanks are due to Nadia Rakovitz, Lars Fischer, Christian Lotz, Patrick Murray, Frank Engster, and Elena Louisa Lang for helping us with the timely advice and encouragement. Thank you also to Amy Allen for her help in pointing us in the right direction when all seemed lost. Finally, we are grateful to the Sage production team and its always helpful and unstinting support. Particular thanks are due to Matt Oldfield, Serena Ugolini, Colette Wilson, and especially to Robert Rojek, who got the ball rolling. A final and most heartfelt, quote, thank you is due to our Volume 1 translators, Kat Moir for Nico Bobka and Dirk Brownstein's chapter on Adorno, Lars Fischer for Ansgar Martin's chapter on Siegfried Krakauer, Adrian Wilding for Stefan Grigot's chapter on Johannes Agnoli, and Jakob Blumenfeld for Christian Fuller's chapter on Alfred Seidel, Hermann Kosiba on Alfred Schmidt, Frank Angster and Oliver Schlaut's chapter on Sohn-Rethel, Ingo Elbers on Helmut Reichelt, and to Max Henninger for Christoph Henning's chapter on Jürgen Habermas. Okay, so I missed all the footnotes, so I'm going to read some of them now. Hopefully it's not super repetitive. Footnote. The outline emphasizes critical theory as a critique of economic objectivity, which according to Martin J. and Jürgen Habermas was not something that Adorno especially concerned himself with. See Habermas Philosophisch-politische Profile, 1987. See J. The Dialectical Imagination, A History of the Frankfurt School and the Institute of Social Research, 1923 to 1950, published in 1973. According to this view, critical theory is fundamentally a critique of instrumental reason and of culture, not of political economy. This is a widely held view. See, for example, Moishe Pistone and Barbara Brick, who argue that Friedrich Pollock's work on political economy spoke for the whole Frankfurt School, which allowed Adorno and others to develop more philosophical and cultural critiques. See Pistone and Brick's article, Critical Pessimism and the Limits of Traditional Marxism, published in Theory and Society, 1982. Footnote. Most decisive are Walter Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history, which he wrote in 1940 and were first published in 1942. According to Benjamin in a letter to Gretel Adorno, the theses focused, quote, some thoughts about which I may say that I have kept them about myself for some 20 years, end quote, and they were to establish a break between what he calls, quote, our way of thinking and the, quote, survival of positivism, end quote, especially in the Marxism of his time. Yet they were not meant for publication, which he said, quote, would throw wide open the doors to enthusiastic incomprehension, end quote. Benjamin. According to Benjamin, history is not on the side of the oppressed. Benjamin therefore argued for its progress to be stopped here and now. Benjamin, see Benjamin Theses on the Philosophy of History in Illuminations, edited with an introduction by Hannah Arendt, 1999. For further argument about this term, and footnote. For further argument about this term at standing at critical theory, see Hans-Georg Backhaus's article, Between Philosophy and Science, Marxian Social Economy as Critical Theory, published in Open Marxism, Dialectics and History, edited by Werner Bonefeld, Richard Gunn, and K. Psychopedis. I think it's Cosmos Psychopedis, 1992. See Helmut Reichalt's article, Marx's Critique of Economic Categories, Reflections on the Problem of Validity and the Dialectical Method of Presentation in Capital, which I believe is on this channel. And see Werner Bonefeld's book, Critical Theory and the Critique of Political Economy, published in 2016. Footnote. And I'm not sure who this quote is from. Quote, all concepts, even the philosophical ones, refer to non-conceptualities, end quote. And footnote. Footnote. The term, quote, conceptualized praxis, end quote, is Alfred Schmidt's. Footnote. On the importance of the concept of experience in critical theory, see especially the work of Oskar Knecht and Alexander Kluge, in particular their book History and Obstinance, published with Zone Books in 2014. And footnote. Footnote. On human contents as distraction and economic argument, see Joseph Schumpeter's book Geschichte der ökonomischen Analyse, published in 1965 in Germany. See also Althusser's Metaphysics of Economic Structure and Being. He defines the social science as a discourse without a subject and argues that one can recognize man only on the conditions that, quote, the philosophical myth of man is reduced to ashes, end quote. See Althusser, Lenin and Philosophy, 1971, and For Marx. Althusser's theory is entirely traditional in its rejection of the subject, man and her social relations, as scientific distraction to social theory. A lot of these are just citations. Let's see. Footnote. Pollock's key contribution to the development of critical theory, his theory of state capitalism, is discussed in depth in Volume 2, Key Themes in the Context of the 20th Century, by Alexander Neupert Doppler in his chapter on political form. Okay, and that's the end of the introduction to Volume 1 of the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Thank you so much for listening.